Late April 1945, somewhere east of the Elbe River, Germany, the engine of the Jeep idled quietly as Captain T. Moffat Burris gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white beneath the dirt and grime of 6 days of combat. The young paratrooper from South Carolina stared through the dusty windshield at a column of German vehicles stretching as far as he could see. Behind him sat his lieutenant and a sergeant, their rifles ready, but woefully inadequate against what lay ahead. Before them waited 15,000 German soldiers of an armored panzer corps. The moment that followed would defy every principle of military logic: 1 jeep, 3 American paratroopers, 15,000 enemy troops with tanks, artillery, and automatic weapons. What happened next was not supposed to be possible. Yet within 30 minutes, the entire German force would lay down their arms without firing a single shot. This was not the result of superior firepower or tactical brilliance. It was the product of one man's audacious bluff and the psychological collapse of an army caught between 2 advancing superpowers. The path to this impossible moment began not in Germany, but in a small town in South Carolina. Thomas Moffat Burris was born in Anderson, South Carolina, on September 22, 1919. He grew up in the textile mill country of the South, where hard work and quiet determination defined a generation. After graduating from Clemson University, Burris took a teaching position at Orangeburg High School. He was, by his own description, an easygoing small-town boy who had not been in a fight in years. He had been part of the Reserve Officer Training Corps at Clemson, holding a Reserve Officer commission. It seemed his future was set, a quiet life teaching history to teenagers in rural South Carolina. Then came Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft attacked the United States Pacific Fleet. Within days, America declared war on Japan. Days later, Germany declared war on America. Burris received orders to report for active duty in January 1942. At age 22, the school teacher became a soldier, but Burris did not want to be an ordinary soldier. He volunteered for the paratroopers, the elite airborne infantry being formed into a new kind of fighting force. The training was brutal. Jump school pushed men to their physical and mental limits. Many washed out. Burris thrived. He discovered something in himself he had never known existed: a capacity for leadership under pressure, an ability to remain calm when chaos erupted around him, a willingness to take calculated risks that terrified others. In April 1942, Burris was assigned to the newly forming 82nd Airborne Division. He became the very first officer assigned to 3rd Battalion, 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment. The 82nd was nicknamed the All-American Division because its soldiers came from every state in the Union. Burris found himself training alongside farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, cowboys from Texas, and dock workers from Brooklyn. Together, they would forge one of the most formidable fighting units in American military history. The 504th Parachute Infantry earned a different nickname from the Germans who fought them: Devils in Baggy Pants. The name came from a diary entry found on a dead German officer after the Battle of Anzio. The officer had written that American parachutists were devils in baggy pants who were never more dangerous than when they were surrounded. The baggy pants referred to paratrooper uniforms, which differed from regular infantry straight-legged pants. It was a compliment of the highest order from an enemy who did not give compliments lightly. By May 1943, Burris and his regiment shipped out to North Africa. His first combat jump came on July 9, 1943, during the invasion of Sicily. The C-47 transport aircraft bounced through heavy anti-aircraft fire. Tracer rounds streamed past as men vomited from fear and airsickness. When the green light flashed, Burris jumped into the darkness over enemy territory. He landed in an olive grove, gathered his scattered platoon, and fought his way to the objective. It was the first of many times he would lead men into impossible situations. September 1943 brought the invasion of Italy at Salerno. The 504th jumped behind German lines to disrupt enemy reinforcements. Burris led his company through 5 days of continuous combat, often outnumbered, always outgunned, but never defeated. Lieutenant General Mark Clark later credited the 504th with saving the Salerno beachhead. Then came Anzio in January 1944. The amphibious landing became a 4-month nightmare of trench warfare. German artillery pounded American positions daily. Casualties mounted. Burris was wounded twice but refused evacuation. He watched friends die in muddy foxholes. He learned that war was not glory. It was survival. And he learned how to keep men fighting when everything told them to surrender. But the defining moment of Burris's war came in September 1944. Operation Market Garden. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery devised an ambitious plan to end the war by Christmas. Airborne forces would seize bridges across the Netherlands, creating a corridor for armored units to drive into Germany. The 82nd Airborne was tasked with capturing the bridge over the Vaal River at Nijmegen. It was a vital objective. Without it, the entire operation would fail. On September 20, 1944, Burris received the order that would test every lesson he had learned. His company would cross the Vaal River in collapsible canvas boats in broad daylight under German machine gun and artillery fire. Then they would assault fortified positions on the far bank. It was a suicide mission by any measure. British officers called it impossible. Burris's own men knew the odds. Yet no one refused. 26 British canvas assault boats, each 19 feet long with plywood bottoms and wooden frames, were brought forward. Each boat was designed to carry 10 paratroopers plus 3 engineers, but they were packed with 13 paratroopers and 3 engineers, 16 men total. Most boats had only 2 or 3 paddles instead of the standard 8, forcing paratroopers to use rifle butts as improvised oars. The Vaal River was 400 yards wide at the crossing point. German positions commanded every inch of the approach. The crossing launched at 2:57 in the afternoon. As the boats pushed off from the southern bank, machine gun fire tore into them immediately. Artillery shells exploded in the water. Men screamed and died. Boats capsized. The river ran red. Burris commanded I Company in one of the 2 lead boats of the first wave. His boat took multiple hits within seconds. The engineer steering the boat, Private First Class Willard Jenkins, was killed by a 20mm shell that shattered his head approximately 1/3 of the way across the river. His blood and brains spilled onto Burris's lap. Shrapnel from the same blast wounded Burris in his ribs. Men fell around him. The canvas sides ripped open. Water poured in. They were sinking. Burris kept his men paddling. The crossing took 15 to 20 minutes of hell. They reached the far bank with 6 men left from 16. Half his company died in that crossing. Only 13 boats from the first wave reached the northern shore intact. Total casualties for the assault reached between 24 and 48 killed and approximately 70 seriously wounded. But they had made it across. Under murderous fire, Burris rallied the survivors. They charged the German positions, hand-to-hand combat in the trenches, grenades and bayonets. No mercy asked and none given. Inch by inch, they fought their way inland. By nightfall, they held the northern end of the Nijmegen Bridge. British tanks were supposed to exploit their success immediately. 4 Sherman tanks from 2nd Grenadier Guards crossed the bridge around 7 in the evening, but then they stopped. Burris waited at the bridge. The tanks did not advance. A British tank commander, Captain Peter Carrington, told Burris they could not advance without orders and because a single German anti-tank gun blocked the road. Burris, who had just lost half his company taking that bridge, exploded with rage. "I have just sacrificed half of my company in the face of dozens of guns, and you will not move because of one gun." Multiple American officers, including Major Cook, Colonel Tucker, and General Gavin himself, subsequently tried to convince British forces to advance. All failed. The tanks remained stationary for 18 to 24 hours, not advancing until 11 o'clock in the morning on September 21. By then, Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's battalion at Arnhem Bridge, 11 miles away, had been overpowered. The British paratroopers who desperately needed relief were forced to surrender. Years later, Lord Carrington, who became British Foreign Secretary, denied the confrontation in his autobiography, stating the exchange did not occur as described, but multiple American paratrooper accounts corroborate the incident and the intense frustration. The British halt had tactical justifications: ammunition and fuel shortages, lack of infantry support, and an exposed elevated dike road unsuitable for tanks. The divide reflected competing military cultures, aggressive paratrooper ethos versus by-the-book guards mentality. Burris received the Silver Star for the Vaal River crossing. The citation praised his brilliant and inspirational leadership and heroism in securing the north end of the vital Nijmegen Highway Bridge. But Burris knew the truth. Bravery had not won that battle. Audacity had, the willingness to attempt what seemed impossible, the capacity to bluff when the odds were hopeless. These lessons would serve him well 6 months later. December 1944 brought the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler launched his final desperate offensive through the Ardennes forest. The 82nd Airborne rushed into combat with little food, ammunition, or winter clothing. They deployed to St. Vith, Belgium, and blocked Kampfgruppe paper at Chinon, delivering the Germans their first defeat of the Battle of the Bulge. Burris and his men held their positions against German tanks and artillery. They fought in sub-zero temperatures. They endured constant bombardment, but they did not break. By February 1945, they were pushing into Germany itself. The final months of the war became a race. Soviet forces advanced from the east. American and British forces drove from the west. Germany was being crushed between two massive armies. Hitler's thousand-year Reich was collapsing in fire and blood. But the fighting was not over. German units trapped between the advancing Allies fought with the desperation of men who knew they were doomed. On May 2, 1945, the 82nd Airborne Division liberated Wöbbeln concentration camp near Ludwigslust. What Burris and his men found there defied comprehension. Approximately 3,500 to 4,000 prisoners, mere skeletons covered in skin, barely alive. Approximately 1,000 dead bodies lying in open pits. Some evidence of cannibalism among the starving. The stench was overwhelming. Men who had fought through 2 years of combat vomited at the sight. Burris shot the lock off a door to liberate prisoners. He was among the first Americans to witness the atrocities. He ordered his troops to document everything with photographs. The world needed to see this. The world needed proof of what the Nazi regime had done. Burris later stated, "The concentration camp in Germany was the worst thing I saw during the entire war." The American army ordered the townspeople of Ludwigslust to tour the camp. German civilians were forced to see what had been done in their name. On May 7, the 82nd Airborne conducted funeral services for 200 victims in the town square. Citizens of Ludwigslust, captured German officers, and several hundred American paratroopers attended. The division chaplain delivered a stinging eulogy, the crimes here committed in the name of the German people and by their acquiescence were minor compared to those found in other German concentration camps. Here there are no gas chambers, no crematoria. These men of Holland, Russia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and France were simply allowed to starve to death. Within 4 miles of your comfortable homes, 4,000 men were forced to live like animals. Burris stood at attention during the service. He had seen terrible things in this war: friends blown apart by artillery, men drowning in the Vaal River, the charnel house of Anzio, but nothing compared to Wöbbeln. Nothing revealed the depths of human evil like that camp. He knew then that defeating Germany was not enough. The world needed to ensure this never happened again. By late April 1945, Allied commanders faced a strategic decision. Soviet forces were closing on Berlin from the east. American forces had reached the Elbe River from the west. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower ordered American troops to halt at the Elbe and allow Soviet forces to take Berlin. The political arrangements for post-war Germany had already been negotiated at the Yalta Conference. Berlin would fall within the Soviet occupation zone. There was no military purpose in American forces fighting their way into a city that would be handed to the Soviets anyway. But Burris chafed at the order. He was 25 years old. He had been fighting for nearly 3 years. Berlin was 40 miles away. The war was almost over, and he was supposed to just sit and wait. It went against everything in his nature. Burris was a man of action. Waiting was torture. On a day in late April, exact date uncertain, Burris made a decision. He later recalled telling his lieutenant and sergeant, "I cannot stand this any longer. Let us get in my jeep and drive across the river and see what we can see. See if there are some crowds still over there." It was not an official order. It was not an authorized reconnaissance. It was 3 paratroopers in a jeep driving into enemy territory because Burris was curious and restless. They drove approximately 40 miles, roughly halfway to Berlin. The roads were clogged with refugees fleeing the Soviet advance. German civilians pushed carts loaded with their possessions. Children cried. Old people stumbled along in exhaustion. The social order of Germany had completely collapsed. Authority no longer existed. Fear ruled everything. Then ahead on the road, Burris saw something that made his blood run cold. German military vehicles. Dozens of them. No, hundreds. An entire column stretching as far as he could see. Tanks, half-tracks, artillery pieces, troop carriers, supply trucks. This was not a scattered group of deserters. This was an organized military formation. A full panzer corps, probably 15,000 troops or more. Burris should have turned around immediately. 3 men in a jeep had no business confronting an armored corps. The smart play was to retreat, report the enemy position, and let division headquarters decide how to handle it. But Burris did not become one of the most decorated officers in the 82nd Airborne by always making the cautious choice. He had a different idea, a crazy idea, an idea that made no logical sense whatsoever, but it just might work. He drove straight toward the German column. His lieutenant and sergeant said nothing, but both men checked their rifles. If this went wrong, they would go down fighting. The jeep rolled up to the lead vehicle in the column. A German officer stood beside it. Burris noticed the man wore a captain's insignia. He spoke English. That was lucky. Burris climbed out of the jeep and walked directly to the German captain. He kept his hand away from his sidearm. No aggressive moves, just confidence. Pure, absolute confidence. "I am here to accept your surrender," Burris announced. His voice was steady, matter-of-fact, as if this was the most natural thing in the world, as if he had not just driven 40 miles behind enemy lines with 2 other men to confront 15,000 German soldiers. The German captain stared at him in disbelief. He looked past Burris to the jeep. 2 men, 1 vehicle, no supporting troops, no tanks, no artillery, nothing. The captain's face registered confusion, then suspicion, then something approaching amusement. He gestured at the jeep and the 2 Americans waiting beside it. "Are you crazy?" he asked in heavily accented English. 3 men in a jeep? It was a fair question. Burris was indeed taking an extraordinary risk. But this was not a moment for rational assessment. This was a moment for audacity, for the kind of bluff that Burris had been perfecting since he jumped into Sicily 2 years ago. He looked the German captain straight in the eye. "I have a whole army of paratroopers and tanks right behind me," Burris said calmly. "And the Russians are right behind you. Do you want to surrender to us or to them?" It was a magnificent lie. There was no army of paratroopers behind Burris. There were no tanks. There was nothing but the same empty road they had driven down. But the German captain did not know that. And more importantly, the German captain desperately wanted to believe there might be an American army nearby because if there was not, his only option was to surrender to the Soviets. And every German soldier knew what that meant. The Soviet Red Army had suffered unimaginable casualties fighting Germany on the Eastern Front. Over 20 million Soviet citizens died in the war. The Soviets had seen their cities burned, their people enslaved, their nation nearly destroyed. They advanced into Germany with a hunger for vengeance that terrified German troops. Stories circulated of mass executions, brutal treatment of prisoners, and systematic reprisals. True or not, German soldiers believed them. The prospect of Soviet captivity was a nightmare that haunted every Wehrmacht officer. American captivity, by contrast, seemed almost civilized. The Americans followed the Geneva Convention. They treated prisoners humanely. They did not execute officers on sight. The German captain knew all this. As he stood in the road looking at Burris, he faced a choice. He could call the Americans' bluff, order his men to disarm these 3 paratroopers, continue the retreat toward wherever they were going, and eventually fall into Soviet hands. Or he could accept what this confident young captain was offering, a chance to surrender to the Americans, a chance to avoid the Red Army, a chance, however slim, to survive this war. The German captain said, "Wait a minute." He turned and walked back down the column. Burris watched him gather 3 or 4 other German officers. They formed a small group beside one of the vehicles and began an animated discussion. Burris could see them gesturing. Some pointed toward him, others pointed east toward the Soviet lines. The debate continued for several minutes. Burris stood perfectly still, his face a mask of confidence. Inside, his heart pounded. This could go either way. Finally, the German captain broke away from the group and walked back to Burris. His hand moved to his holster. Burris tensed. The lieutenant and sergeant in the jeep raised their rifles slightly. This was it. Either surrender or combat. The German captain pulled his pistol from the holster. For a brief moment, Burris thought, "Oh no, not here in the last few days of the war." The captain held the pistol, pointed it at Burris's heart, then turned it around, grip first, and extended it toward Burris, the universal gesture of military surrender. Burris accepted the pistol. He nodded to the German captain. The captain saluted. Behind him, the words spread down the column, "Surrender. The Americans have arrived. We are surrendering." German soldiers began dismounting from vehicles. They stacked their rifles. They removed their sidearms and placed them on the ground. Officers organized their men into orderly groups. The discipline held even in defeat. This was still a professional military force, but it was a defeated one. Burris faced an immediate problem. He had 15,000 German prisoners and no way to guard them or transport them. He had no communication with his division. He had 3 men and 1 jeep. The situation was absurd. He ordered the German officers to maintain control of their troops and begin marching west toward American lines. The Germans obeyed. Burris and his 2 men followed in the jeep, bringing up the rear of the column like shepherds herding sheep. They drove for hours. The column of German soldiers stretched for miles. They passed through destroyed villages and abandoned checkpoints. Occasionally they encountered American patrols who stared in amazement at the sight. Where did all these prisoners come from? The story spread quickly through American lines. Captain Burris accepted the surrender of an entire Panzer Corps with just a jeep and 2 other men. Nobody could quite believe it. When Burris finally reached 82nd Airborne Headquarters, his colonel was waiting. The colonel was not happy. Burris had defied orders. He had driven into enemy territory without authorization. He had taken unnecessary risks. The colonel did not know whether to court-martial him or commend him. For several days, Burris waited to learn his fate. Some officers argued he had shown dangerous disregard for orders. Others pointed out that he had just captured 15,000 enemy soldiers without firing a shot. In the end, the army decided that results mattered more than procedure. Burris was recommended for commendation rather than punishment. Years later, when asked about the incident, Burris was characteristically modest. "I needed a plan and quick," he said. The plan had been simple: bluff with absolute confidence. Offer the Germans a choice between 2 outcomes, one of which was clearly preferable, and pray they took the bait. It had worked because Burris understood something fundamental about military psychology. In April 1945, the German army was broken, not just militarily, but psychologically. They knew the war was lost. They knew Hitler's promises were lies. They were terrified of the Soviets and exhausted from years of fighting. All they wanted was a way out. Burrus gave them one. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. Hitler had committed suicide in his Berlin bunker on April 30. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years. The 82nd Airborne Division received the honor of occupation duty in Berlin. General George S. Patton reviewed the paratroopers and bestowed upon the division a new nickname, America's Guard of Honor. Burrus stood in formation as Patton addressed them, "You are soldiers who jumped into hell and fought your way out." The war had transformed him. At 25, he was a captain, a veteran of 4 major campaigns, and one of the most decorated officers in the airborne. But the war had also changed him in ways that would take years to understand. Burrus returned to South Carolina after the war. He married, started a family, and entered the construction business. He worked at Roper Building Company in Spartanburg, South Carolina, for 15 years before starting his own firm. In 1970, at the urging of his family, Burrus founded Burrus Construction Company with his 3 sons, John Hayes, Moffett Jr., and Francis. The company undertook major construction projects throughout the Southeast. Burrus served as president from 1970 to 1987. In 1982, Burrus Building Systems was founded as a division, then incorporated as a separate business in 1987 by his son Moffett Burrus Jr. From 1977 to 1990, Burrus served in the South Carolina House of Representatives representing Richland County. He brought the same leadership skills he learned in combat to civilian politics: direct, honest, focused on results. His constituents appreciated a man who said what he meant and did what he said. He served as minority leader for 9 years and was instrumental in building the modern Republican Party in South Carolina. He was the first Republican minority leader in the State House of Representatives. In 1977, the film A Bridge Too Far told the story of Operation Market Garden. Actor Robert Redford played a composite character based partly on Burrus in his actions at Nijmegen. Burrus consulted on the film. Watching the recreation of the Vaal River crossing brought the memories flooding back. He could still hear the machine guns, still see his men dying in the boats, still feel the cold water rising as the boat took on more and more hits. In 2000, at age 80, Burrus published his memoir, Strike and Hold, a memoir of the 82nd Airborne in World War II. The book was written at the urging and persuasion of his children. In the prologue, he wrote that he needed to come to terms with war by talking about it and reliving it with men who have shared similar experiences. The book became essential reading for military historians and veterans alike. It was a first-hand account of what it meant to lead men in combat, what it cost, what it took, what it left behind. On September 19, 1994, Burrus made an airborne jump into Holland for the 50th anniversary of Operation Market Garden. He was 4 days shy of his 75th birthday, technically 74 years old. The jump was organized with Pathfinder Holland Reenactment Group at the original battle site in Nijmegen. 15 years later, in September 2009, he returned for the 65th anniversary and made a tandem jump at age 90 strapped to a female jumper from Pathfinder Holland. This 3-day commemoration included a 28-person entourage with family. He was honored by Queen Beatrix of the Netherlands and received the Nijmegen Medal of Honor from the Queen and the Mayor of Nijmegen. The people of Holland had not forgotten. Fresh flowers adorn monuments to the American soldiers who died liberating their country. Dutch children learned in school about the paratroopers who crossed the Vaal River under fire. For Burrus, those visits were profoundly moving. The war had meaning because it had freed people from tyranny. The sacrifices were not in vain. In 2012, at age 92, Burrus spoke at Fort Jackson's quarterly Profession of Arms luncheon for the Army Training Center. For nearly an hour, he held commanders, sergeants, majors, and staff spellbound as he recounted his combat experiences. He told them about shooting the lock off a concentration camp gate to free prisoners. He told them about convincing a German panzer corps to surrender. He told them about being among the first Americans to enter Berlin after Germany's surrender. The audience sat in absolute silence. They were witnessing history. They were hearing from a man who embodied everything the Army aspired to be. One officer who attended that presentation later said, "What resonated most with me as a commander was the simple message that good leaders need to lead from the front and should never expect anything from their soldiers that they would not do themselves." As a result of his exceptional leadership, his men and others who served near him were able to overcome the insurmountable odds they faced and accomplish the missions they were given even under the difficult conditions they experienced throughout the war. In his later years, Burris spoke frequently about leadership, duty, and service. He addressed military audiences, civic groups, and schools. His message was consistent: good leaders lead from the front. Never ask your people to do something you would not do yourself. Take care of your troops and they will take care of you. These were not abstract principles for Burris. They were lessons learned in blood and fire. When asked about the surrender of the 15,000 German troops, Burris always emphasized the context. It was not about him being brave or clever. It was about understanding the situation. Those German soldiers were terrified of the Soviets. They wanted to surrender to the Americans. All he did was give them the opportunity. Any officer who understood the psychology of the moment could have done the same thing. But few officers had the audacity to try. His full military decorations included the Silver Star, 3 Bronze Stars with Combat V4 Valor, Purple Heart, 3 Presidential Unit Citations with 2 Oak Leaf Clusters, French Forager, Belgian Forager, and Dutch Lanyard. The 82nd Airborne Division compiled an extraordinary combat record in World War II. 4 men from the division received the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration. The division earned 4 campaign streamers for action in Sicily, Italy, Normandy, and Central Europe. It liberated concentration camps, captured thousands of prisoners, and held critical objectives against overwhelming odds. Thomas Moffett Burris died on January 4, 2019, at age 99. His funeral service drew hundreds of mourners, including veterans who had served with him, politicians who had worked alongside him, and Dutch citizens who flew across the Atlantic to honor the man who helped liberate their country. South Carolina Governor Henry McMaster said, "Moffett Burris is one of the finest leaders our state and nation has ever produced. He delivered freedom to people around the world and made the lives of those he touched better and safer." The story of Burris and the German Panzer Corps captured national attention when it was first reported. Newspapers called it one of the most audacious actions of the war. Military historians studied it as an example of psychological warfare and individual initiative. But Burris himself never sought fame for the incident. In interviews decades later, he was almost embarrassed by the attention. He insisted he was just doing his job, just trying to end the war without getting anyone killed. Yet the incident reveals something profound about military leadership and the nature of courage. True courage is not the absence of fear. It is the mastery of fear. Burris was surely afraid when he confronted that German column. Any sane man would be. But he controlled his fear. He projected confidence even when the situation was hopeless. He understood that warfare is ultimately psychological. Weapons matter, numbers matter, but mindset matters most. The German officers who surrendered to Burris were not cowards. They were professionals who recognized when continued resistance was futile. They were caught between 2 superpowers, their nation in ruins, their cause lost. Burris gave them a rational choice: surrender now to the Americans or be captured later by the Soviets. The fact that his bluff work says less about his deception and more about the desperation of Germany in April 1945. Some military analysts have questioned whether every detail of Burris's story is entirely precise. 15,000 troops is a suspiciously round number. The details are somewhat vague on exact locations and dates. Burris himself admitted his memory of specific events had faded over the decades. Yet the core of the story is indisputable. American 82nd Airborne after-action reports from late April 1945 document large numbers of German prisoners taken with minimal resistance. Division records note that Captain Burris of I Company, 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, was commended for actions involving German surrender. Multiple veterans from his unit recalled hearing about the incident shortly after it occurred. What we know for certain is this: In the final days of the war in Europe, Moffat Burris encountered a large German military formation. Using nothing but confidence and psychological pressure, he convinced them to surrender without a fight. The exact numbers may be uncertain. The precise details may have blurred with time, but the essential truth remains: one man's audacity accomplished what an army might have struggled to achieve through force. The lessons from Burris's experience extend far beyond military history. They speak to fundamental aspects of human psychology and decision-making. When people are trapped between bad options, they will grasp at any hope of a better outcome. When authority figures project confidence, others follow even against their better judgment. When the cost of resistance seems greater than the cost of surrender, rational actors will choose surrender. Burris understood all these principles instinctively. He did not study psychology or negotiation tactics. He simply knew people, and that knowledge, combined with extraordinary courage, changed the outcome of one small moment in a vast war. The story also illustrates the chaos and fluidity of war's final days. Military historians often focus on grand strategy, major battles, and decisive campaigns. But wars do not end neatly. They dissolve into confusion. Units lose contact with headquarters. Soldiers make decisions without orders. Authority breaks down. In that chaos, individuals like Burris had opportunities to shape events in ways that would be impossible under normal military discipline. Consider what Burris did. He violated direct orders to stay west of the Elbe. He drove into enemy territory without support or communication. He confronted a force that outnumbered him thousands to one. He lied about having reinforcements. He should have been killed or captured. Instead, he pulled off one of the most remarkable bluffs in military history. That combination of audacity, confidence, and calculated risk defines exceptional leadership. Compare Burris's action to the British tank commander at Nijmegen. That officer had overwhelming firepower. He had clear orders to advance. All that stopped him was a single German anti-tank gun and his own hesitation. Burris, by contrast, had nothing but a jeep and 2 other men. Yet he succeeded where the heavily armed tank commander failed. The difference was mindset. Burris understood that in the fog of war, perception matters more than reality. If you can convince the enemy you have overwhelming force, you do not need overwhelming force. In the decades after the war, Burris often reflected on how close he came to death so many times: the jump into Sicily, where he landed under enemy fire, the Salerno campaign where bullets missed him by inches, the 2 wounds at Anzio that could have been fatal, the Vaal River crossing that killed half his company, the confrontation with 15,000 German soldiers that could have ended in his execution. At any of those moments, his life could have ended. The fact that he survived all of them seemed almost miraculous to him. But survival was not random luck. Burris survived because he was smart, because he trained harder than most, because he learned from every combat experience, and because he understood that leadership means taking the same risks you ask of your men. Men followed him, not because he ordered them to, but because he never asked them to do anything he would not do himself. That kind of leadership inspires loyalty that transcends fear. When Burris spoke about the war in his later years, he always emphasized the men he served with rather than his own actions. He talked about the privates who jumped into darkness over Sicily, the sergeants who held their squads together at Anzio, the lieutenants who died leading their platoon across the Vaal. For Burris, the story was never about him. It was about them, the thousands of young Americans who answered their nation's call, endured unimaginable hardships, and helped defeat tyranny. In 2011, at age 91, Burris spoke to the United States Army Chaplain Basic Officer Leadership Course. In 2017, at age 97, he gave an interview to Fox News where he recounted his wartime experiences with the same clarity and humility he had shown throughout his life. Even in his final years, he remained committed to sharing the lessons of leadership and sacrifice with new generations. That was Burris's legacy. Not the medals or the decorations, not the dramatic stories or the incredible risks. His legacy was the example he set, the standard of leadership he maintained, the way he treated his soldiers with respect and led them with courage. Young officers study his actions today not because they are exceptional in the Hollywood sense, but because they demonstrate what is possible when a leader combines competence with audacity. The Jeep that Burris drove toward that German column no longer exists, scrapped decades ago, like millions of other World War II vehicles. The road where he confronted those 15,000 German soldiers has been rebuilt and modernized. The refugees who fled the Soviet advance are long dead. The German officers who surrendered that day have passed into history. But the story endures. It endures because it captures something essential about the human spirit: the refusal to accept defeat, the willingness to take impossible risks, the understanding that sometimes the most powerful weapon is confidence itself. In the final accounting of World War II, Thomas Moffett Burris was one soldier among 16 million Americans who served. His actions were one incident among countless thousands, but his story illustrates what made the Allied victory possible. It was not just industrial capacity or superior weapons or better strategy. It was individual initiative. It was soldiers like Burris who saw an opportunity, seized it without orders, and changed outcomes through pure audacity. When Burris died in 2019, he was one of the last surviving members of his generation. The men who jumped into Sicily are almost all gone now. The paratroopers who crossed the Vol River under fire have passed into memory. The veterans who liberated concentration camps and saw the true cost of Nazi ideology are disappearing. Soon all we will have are their stories. Stories like Burris's Bluff on a German road in April 1945. That story deserves to be remembered not because it was typical, but precisely because it was not. Most surrenders involved lengthy negotiations, superior force, and clear military advantage. Burris's surrender involved none of that. It was 3 men in a Jeep facing 15,000 enemy soldiers. It should not have worked. But Burris was not interested in what should or should not work. He understood that in the chaos of war's end, the old rules no longer applied. He understood that desperate men will believe what they want to believe. He understood that confidence is contagious and that a bold bluff beats a cautious retreat. So remember this story. Remember the school teacher from South Carolina who became one of the most decorated paratroopers in American history. Remember the captain who jumped 4 times into combat and led from the front in every battle. Remember the man who crossed a river under fire, lost half his company, and kept fighting. Remember the officer who confronted 15,000 enemy soldiers with nothing but nerve and convinced them to lay down their arms. Remember Thomas Moffett Burris. Remember that courage is not the absence of fear. Remember that leadership means standing where you ask others to stand. Remember that sometimes the impossible is just the improbable waiting for someone audacious enough to try it. Remember that 3 men in a Jeep, armed only with confidence and a well-timed bluff, can change the course of history. That is the lesson of April 1945. That is the legacy of one remarkable American soldier. That is what happens when ordinary people face extraordinary circumstances and refuse to accept that impossible means the same thing as unable to attempt. The Jeep rolled down that German road with 3 men inside. They confronted an army. They should have died. Instead, they won. And in that victory, however small in the vast scope of World War II, we see the true measure of American military success, not just superior firepower, not just industrial might, but the audacity of soldiers who refused to believe they were outnumbered when they knew they were right.